I often think that really the equivalent right now of a portrait miniature is the image on your mobile phone, because it's something that you carry with you, just like a miniature. It's the same sort of size as a miniature, and it's something you've chosen, and it's something you're looking at all the time. But you're not necessarily, every time I get my phone out, I don't necessarily just say, "Hey, everyone, look what's on my phone." It's just for me.
I'm Carol Woolton, the voice of jewellery. Welcome to If Jewels Could Talk. I'm an author and broadcaster, and the woman who initiated the role of jewellery editor at magazines like Tatler and Vogue. This is a podcast for everyone, for people who do like jewellery, for people who don't realise they like jewellery, and anyone intrigued by fascinating facts, new ideas and forgotten histories. So join me as I tell sparkly tales and meet all sorts of people, delving into 4 centuries of jewellery culture and investigate what's happening now. I am delighted to be here today with Emma Rutherford. She's a specialist in portraiture, the founder of the Limner company. She specialises particularly in portrait miniatures from the 1520s to the 1870s and silhouettes. She's the author of the book Silhouette, The Art of the Shadow, and is the curator of many exhibitions. And indeed, we met at one, which was held at Compton Verney, called The Reflected Self. Emma, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
I mean, portrait miniatures are obviously an art form, but they had specific uses, didn't they? And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about some of the uses that these jewels and little artworks had.
Well, first of all, just to slightly dispel the little element. I mean, yes, they are small, and they are small because of their purpose. But in fact, the word miniature refers to their origin, which they derive from the illuminated manuscript. And there was a red lead pigment called minium, which is connected to the word miniature. So a miniature is really defined by its materials and technique, which in the early years, up until about 1715, so they emerge in the 1520s, really comes all from the illuminated manuscript. So the word limning, you mentioned my company is called the Limner Company. So early miniatures were called limnings, which comes from the word illuminari, as in to give light, illuminated manuscript, which I always think is such a beautiful description of painting, giving light. So although, yes, they are small, they're really defined by their materials and their technique, which is watercolor on vellum. So exactly the same as those wonderful leaves in an illuminated manuscript or
Which were sacred books, essentially.
Yes, but interestingly, the secular documents that were produced at the time, for example, if Henry VIII was to sign a sort of legal agreement with somebody, there would be one of those wonderful, enormous, illuminated first letters, and within that letter, the letter H, and within that would be a portrait of Henry VIII produced by the illuminated manuscript artist. And that portrait of the king was the king there by proxy. So it bodily stood in for the king who couldn't physically be there. So it's really interesting that miniatures, I think somebody once said, if you, with courage and a pair of scissors, you could make your first portrait miniature simply by cutting out that portrait from a document. But it also, there's a sort of, there's a resonance with those portraits in those documents that is missing in other portraiture, because it's standing in for that person. So
it's really as close as you can get to the person being there with you.
Exactly. And miniatures all the way through their history give that unmediated access to reality that other forms of portraiture don't have. So initially they had quite a strong diplomatic role. So if you were French, you would say portrait miniatures originated in France. If you are English, you say that portrait miniatures originated in England. And this comes really from the first exchange of portrait miniatures between the English and French royal families, between Henry VIII and Francis I, ultimately. They were diplomatic, but it was almost as if these monarchs were giving away a little personal slice of themselves. So they become incredibly important in a very sort of multi-layered way. It's not like sending, okay, we need to make Francis very happy. Let's send him the finest, I don't know, piece of embroidery we can, or tapestry, or something incredibly fine that we've produced here in England. But miniatures, it was a little bit like Henry sending the tip of his finger or something. I mean,
Something so personal.
so personal. But of course, at this level, they are also wrapped up in very, very high quality jewels. So they are set into the finest metalwork, and they are often studded with jewels as well. So there's this incredible combination of something very heartfelt and personal, but also a way of showing off, which is, of course, diplomacy at this level.
So was the showing off confined to the gemstones, or was it also in the likeness they portrayed? Because obviously being very competitive, they want to show the high status and wealth and that they were the sort of finest princes. So were they actually truly like them, or did they embellish that fact in the painting?
Well, it's very hard to know because, of course, photography is not invented at this stage, so we don't really know what anybody really looked like. But miniatures had a tradition right from the outset of being painted with the person there in front of you. So, as an interesting side fact, a lot of miniaturists were sent abroad to become spies because you have to have the person in front of you. You've got time passing where you're chatting, you're trying to get the best out of your sitter, and you're painting something directly onto a piece of vellum. You're not sketching, going away and working it up and thinking, oh gosh, I've made the nose a little bit big, I'd better reduce that. So I think in terms of portraiture in general, portrait miniatures or limnings, as they were called, generally agreed to be the best likeness of that person. In fact, we have an unfinished miniature of Elizabeth I, where it's really obvious. She has no teeth, for example. She looks like somebody who's taken their dentures out. She's got an incredibly high hairline where she's obviously lost a lot of hair. She's got these hollowed eyes. She's almost skeletal. This miniature is unfinished, and it's quite possible that Elizabeth took one look at this work
And said, forget that.
yeah. So it is really, really fascinating. And with early miniatures of Henry VIII, for example, you have him without his beard, which is always a bit of a shock. You're like, well, where's the beard? Where's the kind of standard Henry that we're used to? But because this is a portrait of the artist is taking it directly from Henry's face. He's sitting there. He doesn't have a beard. He starts growing a beard a bit later, but there's very, very few portrayals of him without his famous beard. So yeah, they're really, really fascinating, I think, for any historian of any period.
I'm very interested that limners became spies. Do you have an example of that, of somebody who was used in that way and sent abroad on a mission?
Yes, we do have some evidence. So jumping forward a little bit to the 1570s, Nicholas Hilliard, who was Elizabeth I's chief image maker, he was a miniaturist. Interestingly, he was trained as a goldsmith first, so he became a freeman of the Goldsmiths Company, and he starts painting Elizabeth from the very early 1570s. But then he gets an invitation to go to the French court in the mid to late 1570s, where the French court have lost their great miniaturist, Francois Clouet, who we also know from beautiful drawings and paintings. They have a bit of a hiatus at the French court, and Catherine de Medici is obsessed with portrait miniatures. So she's constantly, before this, writing to the Earl of Leicester saying, send me a really good picture of Elizabeth. I need a miniature of Elizabeth. And until Hilliard comes on the scene, they can't really send a decent image of Elizabeth. Hilliard is a natural genius. He's incredibly brilliant at painting portrait miniatures. So finally, Catherine de' Medici gets this magnificent miniature of Elizabeth and can see what she looks like. So the French court invite Hilliard over to France. I think he goes in 1576. It's a very, very tumultuous time. There are the two brothers who are Henri III is on the throne, but his brother is the Duc d'Alençon. There's two rival courts. There's a lot of religious unrest. The poor ambassador from England is constantly writing back saying he can't let anybody in his household out at night because they're Protestant, they're likely to be murdered. And Hilliard is Protestant, but nevertheless, despite Elizabeth totally relying on him, she agrees for him to go to France. And we assume this is partially because he paints both brothers. He paints the king and he paints the king's brother. He's clearly in there information gathering and reporting back to the ambassador, who's reporting back to Walsingham.
So they're so personal on so many levels, because obviously also it was a great source of love to be transferred, wasn't it? And to keep a loved one nearby and to wear it, whether you could talk about this love or you had to secrete it.
They become, I mean, after this initial sort of diplomacy level that they enter at, really, they very quickly become something that is quite a performative object in the role of courtly love, but also genuinely they have a role in secret affairs and clearly genuine love affairs as well. So you do get incredible stories. I mean, I'm working on a miniature at the moment, which I can't really talk about, but it's so fascinating. It's from the 1590s, and I mentioned that portrait miniatures were painted on vellum, which is, of course, a floppy. And in order to make the vellum a surface onto which you could paint, they were pasted onto playing cards. So if you take a miniature an Elizabethan miniature out of its frame, out of its case, and turn it over, you have a playing card. Reverse with a suit on it. And there's great debate whether Hilliard would have ever risked painting Elizabeth on anything other than the Queen. Yeah, probably not. But and that does seem to have been the case. But in other ways, there doesn't seem to be any connections. But the miniature I'm working on at the moment has a two of hearts on the back. But one of the hearts has been completely obliterated with a spear that someone has quite crudely painted over. And what's really interesting, we don't yet know whether this is a dagger to the heart. There is a connection with this miniature potentially with Shakespeare. We don't know whether this is a spear for Shakespeare. We wait for the press to get hold of this. It's going to be very interesting. But one of the most fascinating things is that somebody would have had to have taken this miniature out of its jeweled case
to do that.
Yeah, and to deface this heart. And of course, miniatures at this state, they are encased in a way that allows them to be worn. You know, you couldn't possibly wear something painted on watercolor and vellum next to your skin. It would just come off. The painting would just come off. So the jeweled case becomes an intrinsic part of the miniature and its performance and its purpose. There's an amazing story about Robert Cecil's niece arriving at court and she's in Elizabeth's retinue at court, and Elizabeth spots a miniature that she's wearing and she sort of refuses to show Elizabeth. So Elizabeth just snaps it, grabs it off her, physically grabs it off her, and discovers it's this portrait of Robert Cecil. And she's so furious with this girl for not revealing that she's wearing one of her closest advisors that she pins this miniature to her shoe. And Elizabeth bangs around court all day with this miniature on her shoe, as she's disgusted. This is the lowest place to put the miniature. And then Cecil, of course, starts writing sonnets and about how wonderful Elizabeth was, and you know, he's quite happy to be on her shoe, the lowest point of her physical body, etc. Next day at court, Elizabeth comes in, it's pinned to her elbow. So miniatures were a way of holding somebody physically close to you, but you could also be quite, you know, you could use it as part of your display of love for that person.
And the relationship, and what state the relationship was at that moment. But I'm interested, so the miniature that you're working on now, you are trying to define who it's of, who commissioned it.
We're pretty sure we know who it's of, and we're pretty sure of the date. So it's constructing a story around that. And because they're in these beautiful jeweled cases that nobody wants to necessarily take them out. When you do get the opportunity, and this one was in a very basic case. I mean, they were just found in a box, abandoned literally in a shoebox. We were able to take it out and have a look at the back, but this has added a whole new layer of complication to the story. And I like the idea that if this was a spurned lover, which is what the theory that we're actually working on, that spurned lover kept the case, which was probably worth a lot of money. Because these cases, I mean, one of the things Elizabeth did with miniatures was that she would give her picture to a favoured courtier, and they of course would be very, very grateful for the image of the Queen. It's a very intimate act, almost as you say, these were exchanged between lovers. So for the Queen to give you her picture was really taking you into her inner circle. But what she didn't do was provide the frame. And what you were expected to do was to then go to the best goldsmiths and produce a frame, which Elizabeth would want to see, because you would have to come into court wearing it, of the highest quality. I mean, and spend, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds now on something.
So essentially a double-edged sword, sort of a bit like when she invited herself to stay and would arrive with the whole retinue and it cost thousands and thousands of pounds.
It is the equivalent of we're going to have to build a new wing. So, yeah. But it was clever and very typical of Elizabeth to use miniatures in such a manipulative way, and she does it when she's courting foreign princes as well. So she really uses the miniature to the full advantage.
So how long do you think that miniature had been in that shoebox for?
We think it had been in the shoebox probably for about 50 years. It had been reframed in a very basic sort of early 1900s frame, not even gold, and it is really going to cause quite a lot of ripples.
That's so exciting. So when will it be released, when you can release this information?
It'll probably be in about a month's time.
Watch this space, we'll report back.
You may well want to, yes.
Mainly they're aristocratic, upper middle class. It's not a sort of widespread ritual or pastime, is it?
Well, interestingly, Hilliard was absolutely useless with money, and he was never really properly remunerated by Elizabeth. He didn't get a proper sort of role at court, which is quite surprising for a very long time. So although he seems to have had plenty of commissions, he would also take on commissions from anybody who could pay. So he has also provided us portrait historians with fascinating portraits of people from the merchant classes. When he was in France, for example, he painted Pierre de Ronsard, who is this great poet, but in a very, this was a portrait that was just called An Unknown Man until 2019, when I did some work with a colleague and we discovered that it was Ronsard. But up until that point, it had just been a man in a tall black hat, looking very unaristocratic in very, very plain clothing. It's dated and it has the age of the sitter in lovely calligraphy around the border, which chimed exactly with Ronsard. And then you do get portraits of women who are just in the merchant classes. They're wearing really surprisingly plain clothing, but as long as you could pay Hilliard, he would take on.
He'd do anybody.
Yeah, he would.
And get your secrets out at the same time. There was one that you had in the Compton Verney exhibition, which was a sort of unknown man in an open neck shirt and a beard.
Yes.
And I thought he looked so strikingly modern.
Yes, yeah.
He could have been in a Dolce & Gabbana advertisement.
Literally. I like that. Yes, definitely. No, well, this is obviously, we were talking about the miniature as a love token, and probably the most famous one is that incredible miniature in the V&A of the young man set against flames. And Hilliard, being a goldsmith, had a fantastic ability to use real gold and real silver in his miniatures. So the flames behind this young man, he's put shell gold in the background there, so that in candlelight this miniature would literally have flickered as if it were on fire. A miniaturist like Hilliard would use something called shell gold because he held the paint in mussel shells, I don't know if you saw those in the Compton Verney exhibition. So shell gold and shell silver, a mussel shell is the perfect size for a miniaturist to put their paint. But yes, this miniature in the V&A of the young man, I mean, his shirt is slashed to the waist, and in fact he's holding out a medallion so he's he's literally the first medallion man. He's got huge sort of lovely chain with a medallion on the end. We don't know whether it's a locket that opens out with a miniature of his lover, but he's consumed by the flames of passion. There is no sexier image, I think, in British portraiture, and this image is a 16th century one. So they can be extraordinarily intimate, and people wore in miniatures something that they would never wear in public, let alone in a painting. Be painted for posterity, but in your underwear, really, which is what it was. You wouldn't go out without your waistcoat on top.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean they really are extraordinarily intimate, and their insights into the private life of Elizabethans, which we're always trying to find out, how did people really feel?
Yes. I wonder, because obviously the illusion of how we portray ourselves now in sort of Instagram images and that idea of the reflected self that you had at Compton Verney. But really, miniatures, in a way, had to be the idealized self, didn't they? I mean, now, people can be presented in all kinds of terrible images or just body parts, really. And these were, obviously, you want to look your best for your lover.
It was also important to be recognizable. So I think with miniatures, I would say, rather than idealized, this was your best self. And it didn't, I think miniaturists tried hard not to strip away anything that made you. So there was a miniature in Compton Verney in the final part of the exhibition of a gentleman. He was perhaps in his sort of late 50s, early 60s, and he had an underbite where clearly he couldn't put his bottom teeth away very easily when his face was relaxed. They were there. And these are portrayed by the artist. He hasn't painted his mouth in a way that this chap didn't have. This man would have been instantly recognizable to his family because he had no orthodontic treatment, and I think in the 1780s when it was painted. So, and then there's a miniaturist called John Smart who's working in the 18th century, who literally paints, if you've got crow's feet, he's putting them in. If you've got a wart, it's there.
So if people wanted flattery, not to go to him.
But then again, his miniatures absolutely sparkle. They're so beautiful, but they're also so truthful. I wouldn't say he flattered people, because he did put things in that perhaps you would want to airbrush out. He still gave everybody a beauty. And I guess that was always the balanced skill of the miniaturist. I mean, Hilliard back in the 16th century talks about how you must flirt with your sitters. Presumably female sitters for him, but to get the best out of them, to get that liveliness in the face, that you wanted to bring that person to life in a 2D image because of the person who was commissioning it, somebody who loved them, who knew them. It's impossible to say, but I mean, yes, of course, there would be an element of flattery and idealization, but not perhaps as much as we might think.
And not maybe as in the grand portraits that would be on show.
Yeah, they are. I think people understood that they were for posterity. Miniatures were much more ephemeral in that they were usually painted for a very specific occasion. So usually it's at the point of betrothal. In the 18th century, when people of a certain class were married and they had powdered hair, when miniatures were exchanged, the additional little bit of information that you put in that miniature, other than the portrait on the front, was a lock of hair on the back. And quite often this was an unpowdered lock of hair. So you knew that your future husband or wife, under all that horrible greasy grey powder, was blonde or auburn, and it's this additional little bit of intimacy and information that's contained in the miniatures at that stage.
Stripping away the etiquette of court and finding the real person.
Yes, exactly.
But these sittings, so how long would they sit for?
It varies really over time, but most miniatures take around 6 or 7 hours to paint. So that's a couple of hours over sort of 3 or 4 days for the sitter. But somebody like John Smart, who I mentioned before, he went against convention in terms of painting miniatures, and he did sketches first. He was, by all accounts, quite a dull man, and quite, I think one contemporary calls him a muckworm. He's clearly hardworking, absolute genius artist, but not someone that you want to particularly spend a lot of time with. So I think to get around how long he took to paint these incredibly detailed miniatures, he would do a sketch first. And his sketches are wonderful because they have notes on the back about colours, and sometimes little notes on personality as well. Which are not always very kind. He probably took a little bit of less time with the person there, but then a lot more time creating the actual miniature.
So not that long.
Not that long, no.
And they're sitting there with their mussel shell. What's the thickness of the brush that they'd be using?
Well, again, I hear a lot, oh, they must have used a single hairbrush, but of course a single hairbrush wouldn't hold any paint. So they used squirrel hair brushes that come down to a very, very fine point. And they used a real variety of brushes, but of course they are extraordinarily tiny. I mean, it's quite hard to convey with some of the details in the miniatures just how
extraordinary.
Small
they must have had good eyesight.
Yes.
And only could probably work in the real light of the day as well.
Exactly. You know, they were very confined to daylight hours, north-facing light. They also had problems with the fact that there was so much in the atmosphere. You know, everybody's burning fires. Miniatures are very susceptible to things landing on them. So because they're watercolor, Hilliard writes in his treatise, be careful of spittle. You can't really talk over miniatures. You certainly couldn't sneeze over one. It just sort of blasted. So he talks about, you know, making sure that nothing falls on the surface of the miniature. He even says try not to have dandruff. Can you imagine?
And all the powder coming from the hair, that must have been a bit of a problem.
That must have been, yes, definitely later on that would have been a problem. But they're very specific miniatures in the way that they are painted and conceived, and everybody sort of understood that there were certain rules around miniatures. But I mean, I've come across some incredible things in artists' sort of logbooks where miniatures were painted, and at the end of the sitting, the instructions are that this miniature should be taken under cover of night to somebody, you know, and it's usually a portrait of a woman that then, or a man, and it's then taken under cover of night to the lover of that person. And I love this sort of undercurrent, and the underground nature of miniatures is just endlessly fascinating. That they're not for public consumption. They're not that portrait on the wall that you can have a crowd of people looking at and commenting on. They're an absolute one-on-one experience.
And I guess we can tell so much about fashion through them. And maybe Hilliard's use of silver and gold with the paint helped him depict jewelry and fashion in a much more realistic way.
Yes, and certainly, you know, we were talking about flattering sitters, but I mean the jewels in miniatures in the Elizabethan period were absolutely fact specific. You know, and Hilliard had access to the Royal Jewel House, and being trained as a goldsmith, he created an extraordinary technique to reproduce jewels in 2 dimensions. So when you get a Hilliard miniature under a microscope and you look at a ruby, for example, what he's done there is created a layer of shell gold. And then on top of that, he's used a pinhead to melt. He's melted some turpentine resin, red resin for a ruby, picked it up with the end of a pin and dropped it onto this shell silver. I know, but when I say a pin, so when you look at the jewels in the miniatures under a microscope, they are the size of a pinhead. And then he would use shell gold for the setting of the ruby. So he would create a setting in actual gold, which is powdered gold mixed with honey. And again, we're talking the size of a pinhead, but the shell silver underneath would act as a reflective surface. And of course, the resin is transparent, so it would be like looking through an actual ruby. But when you see some of the miniatures of Elizabeth, and obviously she is covered in jewels. The amount of time it would have taken to create these individual jewels. And unfortunately, the silver that Hilliard uses or used oxidize over time. So when he creates a pearl with obviously a white paint, and then he would put a drop of silver on the top to give it a sheen. That's where it would catch the light. That's oxidized, so that looks black now. So quite often you look at pictures and it looks like women are wearing necklaces of frog spawn, but in fact they would have shone,
glittered.
Literally glittered.
The lace must have been difficult to depict.
Yeah, the lace. So we had an image in Compton Verney of a Hilliard miniature, which was taken in raking light. And which I obviously would never recommend, but if you were to run your finger over a lace ruff in a Hilliard miniature, it would feel like a doily. They are
really
totally three-dimensional. They look like he squeezed toothpaste on to create these incredibly complex ruffs, which of course were sort of folded in figures of 8, and he's got the shadow there where they catch the shadow. They are absolutely astonishing. But then lace was unbelievably expensive and such an important status symbol that he had to recreate that incredibly accurately.
And I guess there was a queue to go to the best portrait miniature artists. And I was quite interested in the exhibition and how you said that actually that became a sort of, it wasn't a political act at all, that you'd have Cromwell going to the same miniature artists as Charles II when he was reinstated as monarch.
Yeah, it's clever, I think, to remain politically neutral as an artist. I curated an exhibition for the Philip Mould Gallery on the artist Samuel Cooper a few years ago, and Cooper worked for the royal family and then for Oliver Cromwell, and in fact he produced the portrait that we call the warts and all portrait, or where that phrase comes from, because Cromwell said to Cooper, if you don't paint me as I am, everything, warts and all, I won't pay you a penny. So that's where the expression comes from. But we used to joke while we were doing that exhibition that Samuel Cooper, the artist, must have had an amazing receptionist who sort of, you get a roundhead come in and yes, you go out this door, sir, while a cavalier comes in, like for his sitting, because he was literally painting both sides simultaneously. And then, as you say, the royal family and Cromwell. It must have been quite difficult.
Yeah. So in that case, they weren't really spying. They were trying to keep their mouths shut.
Right, keep their jobs in order to keep painting.
And then you also talk about how miniatures were used as a parlour game, as sort of novelties.
Yes, so you do get these funny offshoots with miniatures. We did include in the exhibition a really fascinating pair of miniatures, which were actually painted in oil on copper. So they're not true miniatures, they're really just small paintings. And they came with them a set of what are called mica talcs, which are, there's a mica rock, which splits very cleanly with these transparent discs. And in fact, mica was often used for window panes. It almost feels like plastic, but it's a natural substance. And on these discs were painted different costumes that you could overlay onto the original oil paintings. And these were clearly painted and produced during the interregnum when Cromwell is in charge of the country, and this is a puritanical regime. But what was quite funny was with the female sitter in this pair, you could dress her up as a naughty nun, or you could give her the amazing huge diamond earrings and a mask as if she was going to a ball, which of course none of that was happening during this period. So it was a sort of, again, a bit of a subversive underground way of using small portraits, and they were kept in these leather cases, so you could pile up the mica sheets and put them on top of the little oil painting and close the leather case and secrete it on your person, and no one would be none the wiser that you were.
I've been mocking these people.
Exactly. Yes, it's nice to know that that was all happening, and they were clearly having some fun with it as well.
And then later on, they were painted on ivory as opposed to vellum, sort of Victorian, Georgian.
Georgian. From about 1715, ivory becomes the support for the watercolor paint. And we're not quite sure why. I mean, ivory at that period was used in all sorts of ways. It was a fairly readily available material. And initially miniaturists sort of covered the ivory with very thick paint because watercolor on ivory is a really, really impossible task. Ivory is oily. To try and get a water-based paint to stay on, I mean, I have tried it myself and it just sort of slides off. It's really, really difficult. And the ivory had to be prepared. You had to put little, you had to rough it up so that the paint would sort of sit in little nicks on the surface. It had to be ironed between sort of greaseproof sheets to try and extract some of the oil from it. You sort of slightly think, why bother? Until artists like Richard Cosway come in and they use that luminosity of the ivory to show through, to give that kind of color to or that tone to flesh tones. But it is a very odd choice in the beginning to use ivory. There's some thought that ivory was a sort of precious material in that, you know, it was abundant, but not that abundant, and much more expensive than something like paper. So
yes,
perhaps it all goes in with the preciousness of these small jewel-like paintings.
And wanting them to last.
Yes, that's true. Although fugitive watercolor is not great in terms of things lasting. You get a lot of faded miniatures that have been exposed to the light.
And then, of course, it became quite fashionable just to have the eye painted, didn't it? Which made it even less recognisable to the outside world, and only you knew that close-up eye of your lover.
This is such a fascinating sort of sidestep again for miniatures. So we know the story of George, Prince of Wales. Yes, and Maria Fitzherbert, who he's totally obsessed and in love with, and they have this marriage, which obviously is a sort of morganatic marriage, and then she disappears for a year, thinking that he'll get over her, and of course he doesn't. He just gets more and more ardent. And in their exchange of letters and gifts, he says, "So I'm now sending you just my eye in miniature." Which I think you'll find is an incredible likeness. And this act really sparks off this incredible fad of just having your eye painted. I sort of imagine the Ton in London, you know, that highly fashionable set around the Duchess of Devonshire and George IV, all going around wearing these eyes. They're all in these incredibly unhappy aristocratic marriages. They're all having affairs with each other, and you're wearing an eye, and you can imagine people trying desperately to sort of peer at this eye to work out whose eye you're wearing, who are you having a fling with, whose eye you, and of course they're set in beautiful brooches with diamonds and pearls, and sometimes you have a pearl as a tear glued onto the ivory. So artists got more and more sort of inventive with these eyes. I think the intimacy of miniatures really comes through in these eye miniatures. But there's a portrait in an American museum by an American miniaturist called Sarah Goodridge of just her breasts, which was sent to her married.
It's very modern.
And it's called Self-Portrait. Yeah, and it's painted in the early 19th century. And every time I've put it on Instagram, I've been sort of taken down for a while. But it's a genuine historical portrait miniature.
Just what goes on Instagram now, or between selfies that get passed around.
Yes, yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it? I find the eyes very emotional to look at, actually, because some of them, as you say, it has the little pearl teardrop. And although that might be just a sense of longing, or they've been parted for a brief time, you can read all kinds of stories into just looking at that one eye, can't you?
Well, I mean, we struggle enough with portrait miniatures to identify sitters, because unlike oil paintings, there's nowhere to write anything. You know, you can't stick a label on the back of a miniature because you're probably covering up some beautiful enameled case or something. You know, it just doesn't happen. So with eyes, it's like, oh, really? In fact, just before we started recording the podcast, I'm cataloguing an extraordinary box, which is set with 8 eyes, and trying to work out the relationship. the eyes seem to be from people who are all the same sort of age. They're different.
So it's not a family situation.
I'm veering virtually towards orgy here because I'm like, it's impossible.
Because actually, as you say, in the Georgian period, if you weren't sleeping with someone else, it was really frowned upon.
Yeah.
I mean, you had to have a lover, didn't you?
I sold a fabulous portrait miniature, which is going really back to the ancestral family home of Elizabeth Foster, who was the third person in the menage a trois between Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, and her husband, the Duke, and Elizabeth or Betty Foster. And this beautiful miniature by George Englehart was carried around by her stepson. That's your sort of archetypal marriage, really, of the late 18th century, where you have a couple marrying two statuses coming together, and then they're both having an affair with this other woman, but also Georgiana has an affair and has to go into exile and have a child and leave that child in France, despite, I mean, she's so lacking in love in her marriage. Her children, she becomes really quite obsessive about her children and sort of breastfeeds them, and things that are totally out of convention for the time. But yeah, that story, I mean, we think we've seen the worst of human life today, or the most scandalous really of human life today in terms of celebrities, but it was all going on and almost much more publicly back then. So yeah, that's there's so many fascinating stories. But yes, eyes are wonderful and fascinating and weird, but they also, as an art historian, drive me mad.
But you don't have so many breasts to decide who's a whose.
No, I don't. They are, that was a one-off.
And then, of course, photography comes in the sort of mid 19th century. People aren't really rushing to the portrait miniature painters anymore.
No, there are so many connections between really portrait miniatures and photography, including the fact that miniaturists they're itinerant. The certain miniaturists who don't have a very cushy studio in London will move around the country. So, in fact, I'm recording this from Bath, which during the season, miniaturists would hire out rooms above particular shops and establishments, and it was part of the entertainment of the day to go to have your miniature painted. And of course, everyone's looking for husbands, and so it's perfect for miniaturists to set up somewhere like Bath for the season. Photography comes in, and of course, it provides everything that miniatures couldn't. It provides an amazingly accurate image in a very short period of time.
Can't provide colour though.
No, but the miniaturists who really were then out of a job when photography really gets going become colorists in studios for photographers. So there was actually a bit of a sort of like, well, photographs are great, but people were so used to seeing these wonderful coloured portraits that, I mean, even in the Victorian period where where we're very close to photography being invented, the colours are just astonishing and beautiful. Then you get these sepia images. I think people were rather horrified. So they are initially coloured. There's a sort of Edwardian revival as well with miniatures there, and there are a couple of really amazing exhibitions at the South Kensington Exhibition, now the V&A, in the 1860s, where they pulled in particularly early miniatures, and people became very, very interested just at the point where photography is really becoming cheap and accessible to everybody. There's a sort of huge nostalgia for the portrait miniature, and I'm happy to say that's sort of back now. Really, people are gripped by them, and the stories that they can tell, and just how beautiful they are as well. There's nothing quite like miniatures.
Have you ever been painted in a miniature?
I've had my silhouette taken a lot of
Have
times.
you?
I did. I sat for a photograph that was done by a photographer called Bettina von Schweil at the V&A. She was artist in residence there, and she was looking at the miniatures in the V&A collection and was being very inspired by those. And it was very weird being the other side of the of the lens, or the I mean, she very much worked as an artist, or works as an artist, and sort of deciding what to wear. You don't want to wear anything that is going to go out of date, but also it's a photograph, so it is capturing a moment in time, just as miniatures were. So I wanted to look sort of fashionable, and it was a very, very good experience to have, because it gives you a huge insight into how people that I'm looking at now in antique miniatures must have felt. So I also took my daughter. She was photographed at the time, and she was a very sort of wriggly, irritated, didn't want to sit still 8-year-old. So now every time I look at a portrait miniature of a child, I think, oh, you poor artist. Keep this child entertained, and they obviously don't see the point in the same way that adults do. So it was a really interesting experience. But no, there are miniaturists around now. There's a Royal Miniaturist Society and another society called the Hilliard Society. But I think once photography came in, our visual perceptions just completely changed around portraiture, and you can't undo that, and you can't really go back to how miniaturists saw people or tried to produce portraits.
Yes, I do see portrait jewels around, modern ones created by contemporary jewelers, but I have to tell you that the majority of them are of people's dogs. So I think that tells something about our society now.
Yeah, well, I often think that really the equivalent right now of a portrait miniature is the image on your mobile phone, because it's something that you carry with you, just like a miniature. It's the same sort of size as a miniature, and it's something you've chosen, and it's something you're looking at all the time. But you're not necessarily, every time I get my phone out, I don't necessarily just say, "Hey, everyone, look what's on my phone." It's just for me. And it's my husband and my daughter. It was my dog, but I thought I better upgrade.
Yeah, but most people have their dogs, I have to say.
Yeah. So, but that really is the equivalent now, I think, of a miniature. But nothing really can take you back to that experience of being presented with a I mean, it must have been a really astonishing moment.
Frisson of excitement when you revealed it, and obviously that's why George IV and Maria Fitzherbert sent about 8 or 9 between them, didn't they? They had them done the whole time.
They did. He's buried with a miniature of Maria. So
very touching.
He never fell out of love with her. But no, the miniatures are the central point of their love story.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, Emma. Fascinating. And everybody look at their selfies this morning and think what they want on their phone, because it says a lot about them. And thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing more about what you're up to in the future.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening. For this and other episodes of If Jewels Could Talk, please go to our website, carolwoolton.com. Do share it any way you can if you've enjoyed it. And we love to have a rating and a comment. And if possible, a star. The book of the podcast is out now at all good bookstores and from Amazon. And join me again in 2 weeks for the next Jeweled Nugget. In fact, this is going to be our season finale. We're going to take a little summer break. After this, we might come back with a special episode answering questions towards the summer holidays. But this will be our great season finale, and it's a really good one. I wanted to ask the question of you whether you contemplated the idea of putting on lipstick, adding colour to enhance your face is a bit like wearing a coloured piece of jewellery. And my season finale guest is the legendary makeup artist Val Garland. She's going to talk about colour, her career, and dipping her toe into designing a costume jewellery line. So you're going to hear it first on If Jewels Could Talk. So join me in 2 weeks, and thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye. If Jewels Could Talk with Carol Woolton is produced by Natasha Cowan, music and editing by Tim Thornton, graphics by Scott Bentley, illustration by Jordi Labanda.